Have you ever held on to a promise long after everyone else told you to let it go? Have you ever kept a light burning in your heart for someone through years of silence, clinging only to the memory of their love? This is the story of Clara Thompson, a woman of strength and grace running her family's farm alone, her heart tethered to a man who rode off to war and vanished into a silence broken only by the echoes of distant cannon fire. And this is the story of James Callahan, a man who left as a boy, full of dreams, and returned from the horrors of battle a shattered soul, believing the wounds he carried, both seen and unseen, made him unworthy of the love he left behind. For 3 long years, a question hung between them, as vast as the Montana sky itself. Can a love tested by distance, trauma, and the cruel passage of time ever find its way home? Or are some silences too deep to bridge? This is a tale of lost letters and second chances, of courage not just on the battlefield, but in the human heart. It's a journey back to a time when a promise was forever and love was worth waiting for, no matter how long the winter. If you believe in stories where love endures, where hope is a light that never goes out, and where redemption is found in coming home, then you are in the right place. Join us for this complete, heartfelt journey in Letters at Dusk. And if this is the kind of story that speaks to your soul, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. We are dedicated to bringing you more beautiful, classic romances that celebrate enduring love, strength of character, and the values that truly matter. Settle in, relax, and let's begin. Chapter 1: Twilight in Montana, 1863. The year was 1863, and the golden light of evening stretched across the rolling hills of Montana Territory like honey poured over freshly baked bread. Clara Thompson stood on the wooden porch of her family's modest farmhouse, her calloused hands gripping the rough-hewn railing as she watched the sun sink lower toward the distant mountains. At 23, she had the kind of beauty that came from honest work and genuine kindness. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunset, green eyes that held both determination and tenderness, and a smile that could warm a room even on the coldest winter night. But tonight, there was no smile on her face. Tonight, her heart felt as heavy as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The farm around her told the story of a family doing their best to survive in difficult times. The vegetable garden she'd planted and tended showed neat rows of corn, beans, and squash. The chicken coop her father had built before he'd taken ill housed a dozen laying hens that provided eggs for both the family table and the small income they brought at the general store in town. The barn, weathered but sturdy, sheltered their 2 dairy cows and the old mare Buttercup, who'd been with the Thompson family for over a decade. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. And Clara had worked harder than any man to keep it running since her father's fever had left him bedridden 3 months ago, and her younger brother Tom had gone off to join the Union Army despite being barely 18. She heard the creak of wagon wheels on the dirt path before she saw the familiar figure driving toward the house. James Callahan sat tall in the driver's seat of their family's wagon, his dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. his strong shoulders filling out the blue cotton shirt she'd helped his mother mend just last week. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way he held the reins just a little too tightly. Her heart began to race, though she tried to keep her expression calm. James had been coming around the Thompson farm for months now, helping with the heavier chores her father could no longer manage, sharing meals at their kitchen table, and stealing moments alone with Clara when propriety would allow. She'd grown to look forward to his visits more than she cared to admit, even to herself. But today was different. Today, she could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he climbed down from the wagon with movements that seemed both determined and reluctant. "Evening, Clara," James said, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was nervous about something important. "Evening, James." She stepped down from the porch, smoothing her simple blue dress with hands that trembled just slightly. "You're later than usual. I was starting to worry." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. His eyes were the color of coffee, warm and rich, but tonight they held shadows she'd never seen before. "Clara, I need to tell you something I should have told you days ago, but I kept hoping." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "I received word from the recruitment office in Virginia City. They're calling up more volunteers for the Union Army. I leave tomorrow morning." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd known this day might come. Every young man in the territory was talking about the war, about duty and honor, and fighting for what was right. But knowing something might happen and hearing it spoken aloud were two very different things. "Tomorrow?" The word came out as barely a whisper.
"Clara, James stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of hay and leather that always clung to him. "I didn't want to leave without telling you how I feel about you. These past months, getting to know you, seeing your strength, your kindness, you've become the most important thing in my world." She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "James, please don't. No, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know I don't have much to offer you right now. I'm just a rancher's son with more dreams than dollars. But when I come back from this war, I want to build something real with you. I want to marry you, Clara Thompson, if you'll have me." The tears she'd been holding back began to spill down her cheeks. "You can't promise to come back. You can't promise anything in times like these." "You're right," he said, reaching up to gently wipe away her tears with his thumb. "I can't promise I'll come back, but I can promise that every day I'm gone, I'll be fighting to get back to you. And I can promise that no matter what happens, you'll always have my heart." Before Clara could respond, James pulled something from his shirt pocket, a folded piece of paper sealed with wax. "He wrote this for you," he said, pressing the letter into her hands. "Don't read it now. Wait until after I'm gone. It says everything I wish I had more time to tell you in person." Clara clutched the letter against her chest, feeling the weight of it, the importance of it. "James, say you'll write to me," he interrupted, his voice urgent now. "Say you'll wait for me, at least until you know for certain what's happened to me. I know it's selfish to ask, but—" "Yes," Clara said, the word escaping before she could think about it. "Yes, I'll write to you. I'll wait for you." The relief that flooded James's face was almost heartbreaking. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as the last light of day faded around them. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, strong and fast, matching the rhythm of her own. "I have to go," he whispered against her hair. "My mother is expecting me for supper, and I still have packing to finish." Clara nodded against his shoulder, not trusting herself to speak. James pulled back just enough to look into her eyes one more time. Then, before either of them could lose their courage, he leaned down and kissed her. It was their first kiss, soft and sweet, and full of promises neither of them knew if they could keep. When they broke apart, Clara touched her fingers to her lips, memorizing the feeling. "Write to me as soon as you can," she said. "Tell me where you are, that you're safe." "I will," James promised. "And Clara, take care of yourself. Don't work so hard that you forget to live a little." She managed a small smile at that. Someone has to keep this place running until the men come home. "That's my girl," he said, and the pride in his voice made her heart swell, even as it broke a little. James climbed back into his wagon and picked up the reins, and as he drove away into the gathering darkness, Clara stood on her porch holding his letter, watching until the sound of wheels on dirt faded into the night sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Only then did she allow herself to break down and cry for the uncertainty that lay ahead, for the man she loved who was riding to war, and for the letter in her hands that might be the last words she'd ever receive from James Callahan. Chapter 2. Letters by Lamplight. 3 weeks had passed since James Callahan rode away into the Montana darkness, and Clara Thompson had established a ritual that had become as essential to her as breathing. Every evening, after the last of the dinner dishes were washed and put away, after her father had been helped to bed and given his evening medicine, after the animals were fed and the doors were locked against the prairie night, Clara would light the oiled lamp in the kitchen and sit down at the worn wooden table with paper, ink, and pen. The first letter had been the hardest to write. She'd stared at the blank page for nearly an hour that first night, the lamp flame flickering and casting dancing shadows across the kitchen walls. How did one begin a letter to a man who might be marching toward his death? How did one share the ordinary details of farm life when he was facing the extraordinary horrors of war? In the end, she decided to write as if she was speaking to him directly, as if he were sitting across from her at this very table, sharing coffee and conversation as they had so many evenings before. "My dearest James," she had begun, "I hope this letter finds you well and safe. I opened your letter the morning after you left, and I must have read it 10 times before noon. Your words gave me such comfort, knowing that your feelings for me are as deep and true as mine are for you." Tonight, as she prepared to write her 15th letter to James, Clara had developed a routine that brought her a strange sort of peace. She would first read his most recent letter, when she had one, aloud to the empty kitchen, as if speaking his words could somehow bring him closer. Then she would write her own letter, telling him about her days, her worries, her hopes, and always, always, how much she missed him. She reached for the wooden box where she kept James's letters, all 4 of them that had arrived so far. The first had come just 10 days after he'd left, postmarked from Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory.
Clara's hands had shaken so violently when the postmaster handed it to her that she'd nearly dropped it right there in the general store. She unfolded that first letter now, though she knew every word by heart, and began to read aloud in the quiet kitchen. My darling Clara, I am writing this by firelight in a camp full of strangers who are becoming brothers. The journey to Fort Laramie was long and dusty, but your memory made every mile bearable. I carry your image with me always, the way you looked standing on your porch that last evening, so beautiful and brave, even though I could see the fear in your green eyes. That fear was for me, and knowing that someone cares enough to fear for my safety gives me more strength than any weapon ever could. Clara paused, as she always did at this part, touching her fingers to her lips as she remembered their first and only kiss. The second letter had arrived 2 weeks later, postmarked from somewhere in Missouri. James's handwriting had been more hurried in that one, and she could sense the urgency behind his words. We are moving quickly now, Clara. I cannot tell you exactly where, as the officers say loose talk can endanger lives, but know that every step takes me further from you and closer to whatever destiny God has planned for me. The other soldiers speak of sweethearts and wives waiting for them at home, and I am proud to tell them about the most beautiful, strongest woman in all of Montana Territory. They tease me for carrying your letters in my shirt pocket, right over my heart, but I don't care. Let them tease. The third letter had been different, darker. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, and Clara could still feel her heart breaking every time she read it. My dearest Clara, I have seen things now that I pray you will never have to see. The reality of war is nothing like the stories we heard back home. Men die here, good men with families and dreams just like ours. I watched a boy from Nebraska, couldn't have been more than 17, breathe his last yesterday while calling for his mother. It made me think of your brother Tom, and I pray every night that he is somewhere safe, far from the fighting. I hope my letters are not too melancholy, but I find I cannot lie to you about what this life is like. You deserve my honesty, even when the truth is difficult. The fourth and most recent letter had arrived just yesterday, and reading it always left Clara with a mixture of relief and worry. Clara, my love, I am well and uninjured, though I cannot say the same for many of my fellow soldiers. We have been in 2 battles now, and by God's grace, I have come through both unharmed. I think of you constantly. When I wake in the morning, I imagine you feeding the chickens and gathering eggs. When we make camp at night, I picture you reading by lamplight in your father's chair. When the fighting is at its worst, I hold your memory like a shield, and somehow it keeps me safe. How is your father's health? Are you managing the farm work alone? I worry that you are doing too much, working too hard. Please ask the neighbors for help if you need it. Your pride is one of the things I love about you, but not if it puts your health at risk. Clara folded the letters carefully and returned them to their box. Each one was more precious to her than gold, proof that James was alive, that he was thinking of her, that their love was surviving the terrible test of separation and war. Now it was time to write her response to that fourth letter. She dipped her pen in ink and began. My beloved James, Your letter arrived yesterday, and I cannot tell you the relief I felt seeing your familiar handwriting on the envelope. Every time I go to the post office, my heart beats so fast I fear it might stop altogether. Mr. Henderson, the postmaster, has taken to giving me a sympathetic smile when there is no letter waiting. And I know he understands what these correspondences mean to the women in town who have loved ones fighting. You ask about Father's health. He is growing stronger slowly. Dr. Mitchell says the worst of the fever has passed, and Father was able to sit on the porch for an hour yesterday evening, watching me tend to the evening chores. You would be proud to see how well I'm managing everything. The corn is growing tall and strong, the chickens are laying well, and old Buttercup seems to understand that she must behave herself, since there is no strong man around to handle her if she gets ornery. Clara paused, smiling slightly at the memory of yesterday's minor battle with their stubborn mare. Mrs. Patterson from the next farm over brought us a pot of stew yesterday and stayed for coffee. She told me her youngest son, David, received word that he'll be joining the army next month. He's only 19, James, the same age as my Tom. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering how many young men from our little corner of Montana will march away to this war, and how many will come home again. But I don't want to burden you with such dark thoughts. Let me tell you something that will make you smile. Yesterday morning, I found one of our hens had built a nest in your mother's old rose bush behind the house. She was sitting on 4 eggs, looking quite proud of herself for finding such a clever hiding spot. It reminded me of the day you helped me catch that same hen when she escaped from the coop, and we ended up chasing her all over the yard until we were both covered in dust and laughing so hard we could barely breathe. Clara's eyes misted as she wrote, remembering that happy afternoon that seemed like a lifetime ago now. I keep your letters in a wooden box that belonged to my grandmother. Sometimes, when the loneliness feels overwhelming, I take them out and read them by lamplight, and it's almost as if you're here with me. Your words are my greatest treasure, James. They remind me that somewhere in this vast, dangerous world, there is a man who loves me, who is fighting to come home to me. I must close now as the lamp oil is running low and morning comes early on a farm. Please stay safe, my darling. Know that I think of you with every sunrise and pray for you with every sunset. You carry my heart with you wherever this war may take you. All my love, always and forever, Clara. She signed her name with a flourish, then folded the letter carefully and sealed it with wax. Tomorrow, she would ride into town and post it, hoping it would find its way across the miles of dangerous country to wherever James was stationed. As Clara extinguished the lamp and made her way upstairs to bed, she couldn't help but wonder when his next letter would arrive. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part of all. The long stretches of silence when she had no idea if he was safe, if he was thinking of her, if he was even still alive. But she would wait. She would keep writing, keep hoping, keep believing that love was stronger than war and that someday, somehow, James Callahan would come home to her. Outside her bedroom window, the Montana night stretched endlessly towards the horizon, and somewhere beyond those distant mountains, under the same stars she was looking at, the man she loved was perhaps writing a letter of his own by the dying light of a military campfire.
Chapter 3. The Unexpected Silence.
September arrived in Montana territory with a crispness that promised an early winter, and Clara Thompson had not received a letter from James Callahan in 6 weeks. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the first golden leaves fall from the cottonwood tree by the creek, and tried to push down the growing panic that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. 6 weeks. 42 days of checking the post office every other day, of searching Mr. Henderson's face for any sign of an envelope bearing James's familiar handwriting, of walking home empty-handed with her heart sinking a little more each time. The last letter had arrived on a sweltering day in mid-July. James had written from somewhere in Tennessee, his words filled with exhaustion, but still carrying that underlying thread of love that had sustained Clara through the long months of separation. My darling Clara, the heat here is unbearable, and the fighting has been fierce. We lost good men at Chickamauga, but by God's grace, I remain unharmed. Your letters are my lifeline, dear one. When I read your words about the farm, about your father's improving health, about the simple beauty of Montana sunsets, I remember what I'm fighting to return to. That had been 7 weeks ago, and since then, nothing. Not a word, not a single line to tell her whether James was alive or dead, wounded or well, still thinking of her, or... Clara couldn't bring herself to complete that last thought. She turned away from the window as her father's voice called from the parlor. At 52, William Thompson was finally regaining his strength after the fever that had nearly claimed his life in the spring. His hair had gone completely gray during his illness, and he moved more slowly than before, but the sharp intelligence in his blue eyes remained unchanged. "Clara, come sit with me," he said, patting the chair beside his own. "I've been watching you pace around this house like a caged mountain lion for days now." Clara settled into the chair, smoothing her dark green skirt and trying to appear calm. But her father had known her for 23 years, and she'd never been able to hide her feelings from him. "It's been 6 weeks, hasn't it, since James's last letter?" She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. "Wars are unpredictable things, Clara. Communications get disrupted. Units move quickly from place to place. Letters get lost or delayed. There could be a dozen innocent explanations for why you haven't heard from him. Or he could be dead," Clara whispered, finally voicing the fear that haunted her every waking moment. "He could have fallen in some nameless battle, and I might never know what happened to him. Or," she paused, her voice catching, "or he could have decided that a farm girl in Montana isn't worth the trouble of writing to anymore." Her father reached over and took her hand in his weathered one. "Clara Thompson, I've watched that young man look at you for months, and I've never seen a man more completely besotted. James Callahan would crawl across broken glass to get back to you. If his letters have stopped coming, it's not because he stopped loving you." Before Clara could respond, the sound of a horse and wagon approaching drew her attention to the window. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm was climbing down from her buckboard, her round face wearing an expression of determined cheerfulness that Clara had learned to dread. In the months since James had left, several of the local women had appointed themselves Clara's advisors, and their advice always seemed to center around the same theme. It was time to move on. "Good afternoon, William, Clara," Mrs. Patterson said as she bustled into the parlor without waiting for an invitation. "My, you're looking better every day, William. The color's back in your cheeks." Thank you, Eleanor. Can Clara get you some coffee? That would be lovely. Mrs. Patterson settled her ample form into the chair across from Clara and fixed her with a meaningful look. Actually, I'm glad I caught you both together. I have some news that might interest you, Clara. Clara's heart leaped. News about James? About the war? No, dear, nothing like that. Mrs. Patterson's tone became gently patronizing, the way one might speak to a child who needed to be told a difficult truth. It's about young Samuel Morrison. You remember Samuel. He's the one who took over his father's mercantile when old Mr. Morrison passed last winter. Clara frowned, not understanding where this conversation was headed. Of course I remember Samuel. What about him? Well, he's been asking questions about you around town. Specifically, he's been asking whether you might be available for courting. The word hit Clara like a slap. Available? I'm not available, Mrs. Patterson. I'm waiting for James to come home from the war. Oh, my dear girl. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her voice taking on that patient, understanding tone that made Clara want to scream. It's been over 5 months since James left. And how long since you've heard from him? 6 weeks? 7 weeks? 6 weeks, Clara said stiffly. Exactly. Now, I'm not saying anything has happened to the boy, but, well, these are dangerous times, Clara. Young men march off to war every day, and not all of them come home. At what point do you stop waiting for someone who might never return?
Clara felt her father tense in the chair beside her, but she didn't need him to defend her. She was perfectly capable of defending herself. I stop waiting when I know for certain that there's no one left to wait for, she said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Not a moment before. But Clara, you're 23 years old. You're a beautiful, capable woman with so much to offer the right man. Samuel Morrison is successful, stable, and he's here, not off fighting in some distant war. He could give you security, a comfortable home in town. I don't want security from Samuel Morrison, Clara interrupted, rising from her chair. I want James Callahan to come home safely. And until I know for certain that's not going to happen, I'm not interested in anyone else's idea of what I should do with my life. Mrs. Patterson's face reddened slightly. I'm only trying to help, dear. I hate to see you wasting the best years of your life waiting for what? Clara's voice rose, all pretense of politeness abandoned. Waiting for the man I love? Waiting for the man who promised to come back to me? That's not wasting my life, Mrs. Patterson. That's called being faithful. Faithful to a memory, perhaps, but that's enough, Eleanor. William Thompson's voice cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Despite his recent illness, there was still authority in his tone, still the voice of a man who had commanded respect in this community for over 2 decades. My daughter has made her position clear. I think it's time you respected her decision. Mrs. Patterson stood, her face flushed with embarrassment and indignation. Well, I never meant any offense. I was simply trying to be a good neighbor. I know you were, Clara said, forcing herself to speak more gently. And I appreciate your concern. Truly I do. But I'm not ready to give up on James yet. After Mrs. Patterson left, Clara sank back into her chair, emotionally drained. Her father watched her carefully, his wise eyes seeing too much. That won't be the last conversation like that, he said quietly. I know. Clara stared at her hands folded in her lap. Maybe she's right. Maybe I am being foolish. Maybe James is... She couldn't say the word.
Maybe he is, her father agreed. Or maybe his unit is deep in the enemy territory where no mail can get through. Maybe he's been wounded and is recovering in a field hospital somewhere. Maybe he's been reassigned to a different regiment and doesn't know how to reach you. There are 100 possible explanations, Clara, and only one of them involves him being dead. What if he's not dead? Clara asked, voicing her other secret fear. What if he's forgotten about me? What if he's met someone else, someone closer to wherever he's stationed? William Thompson looked at his daughter with infinite compassion. Then he's a fool who doesn't deserve you. But I don't believe that's what's happened. I saw how that young man looked at you, Clara. I heard the way he talked about you, about his plans for the future. That wasn't the behavior of someone who would forget easily. Clara nodded, but doubt continued to gnaw at her. The silence from James was becoming harder to bear with each passing day, and the well-meaning pressure from neighbors like Mrs. Patterson wasn't helping. She felt caught between hope and despair, between faith and practical reality. That evening, as she had every evening for months, Clara lit the oil lamp and sat down at the kitchen table with paper and pen. But tonight, for the first time, she hesitated before beginning to write. What if James never received her letters? What if she was pouring her heart onto paper that would never be read by the man she loved? She dipped her pen in ink and began anyway. My dearest James, it has been 6 weeks since your last letter, and I confess that fear has begun to root in my heart. I don't know where you are, whether you're safe, whether you still think of me as often as I think of you. The silence is harder to bear than I ever imagined it could be. Today, Mrs. Patterson came to visit, and she suggested that perhaps it's time for me to move on, as she put it. The idea that I should stop waiting for you, stop believing in your promise to come home, feels like betrayal of the deepest kind. How does one simply stop loving someone? How does one turn away from a promise made under the Montana stars? I know you would not want me to waste away waiting for you if something terrible has happened. I know you would want me to find happiness, even if it has to be with someone else. But I'm not ready for that yet, James. I'm not ready to give up on us. Please, if you are able, if you are reading this, send me just one word to let me know you're alive. I don't need long letters anymore. I don't need promises or plans for the future. I just need to know that somewhere in this world, James Callahan still draws breath. Until I hear from you again, I remain faithfully and completely yours, Clara. As she sealed the letter, Clara allowed herself to shed the tears she'd been holding back all day. 6 weeks of silence had tested her faith in ways she'd never anticipated. But she wasn't ready to surrender yet. Not yet. Outside, the first frost of the season glittered on the window panes, and winter was coming to Montana territory. Clara could only hope that wherever James was, he would survive to see another spring, and that when it came, he would find his way back to her. Chapter 4. Return to the Earth. October 1863, East Texas. The wagon wheels creaked against the hard-packed dirt road as James Callahan shifted uncomfortably on the wooden seat, trying to find a position that didn't send lightning bolts of pain through his left shoulder. Every bump and rut in the road reminded him of the Confederate shell fragment that had torn through muscle and bone at the Battle of Chickamauga 6 weeks ago, leaving him with an arm that would never again have the full strength it once possessed. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the damage that had been done to his soul. The familiar landscape of East Texas spread out before him, rolling hills covered in oak and pine, creeks that ran clear and cold, pastures where cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. It was beautiful country, the land where he'd been born and raised, but James felt like a stranger looking at it through glass. Everything seemed too bright, too peaceful, too removed from the nightmare world of war he'd left behind. The driver of the wagon, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, who'd lost his right leg at Shiloh, glanced over at his passenger with understanding eyes. "You're mighty quiet, son. Almost home now. Your mama's gonna be beside herself with joy when she sees you." James managed a weak smile. "Yes, sir. It'll be good to see her again." What he didn't say was that he dreaded the moment when his mother would look into his eyes and see what the war had done to her youngest son. What he didn't say was that he wasn't sure he deserved the welcome he was about to receive. The Callahan Ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, a modest spread of about 300 acres with a white farmhouse, red barn, and corrals where his father bred horses for the cavalry. James's chest tightened as he saw a figure in a blue dress hurrying out of the house, followed by a tall man with graying hair and a familiar weathered face. "James! Oh, dear Lord, James!" His mother, Margaret Callahan, ran toward the wagon with tears streaming down her face, not caring that her skirts were getting dusty or that the neighbors might see her behaving in such an undignified manner. Thomas Callahan followed more slowly, his expression carefully controlled, but James could see the relief and concern warring in his father's dark eyes, eyes that were so much like his own. As Murphy helped James down from the wagon, favoring his injured arm, Murphy threw herself into his son's embrace with a sob of pure joy. "My boy, my dear boy, when we got word that you'd been wounded, I was so afraid." "I'm all right, Mama," James said quietly, holding her with his good arm and breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and fresh bread that had always meant home to him. "I'm all right." But as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. He wasn't all right, and he might never be all right again. His father stepped forward and clasped James's good hand in both of his own. "Welcome home, son. We're proud of you." Proud. James had to swallow hard against the bitter taste that word left in his mouth. If his parents knew the things he'd done, the things he'd seen, the nightmares that haunted his sleep, would they still be proud? If they knew that he'd killed men, boys really, some of them no older than 18, would they still welcome him home with such joy? "Let's get you inside," Margaret said, wiping her eyes with her apron. "You're too thin, and that arm needs proper tending. I've made your favorite beef stew, and there's apple pie cooling on the windowsill." As they walked toward the house, James felt like he was watching the scene from outside his own body. This warm, loving reunion, this talk of stew and pie and tending wounds, it all felt surreal after months of death and destruction and men screaming for their mothers as they bled out in the mud. His room had been kept exactly as he'd left it. The quilt his grandmother had made still covered the narrow bed. His books were still arranged on the shelf by the window. On the small desk, his mother had placed a jar of wildflowers, their bright colors tearful against the dark wood. But what caught his attention, what made his breath catch in his throat, was the stack of letters on his bedside table. Letters addressed to Miss Clara Thompson, Montana Territory. Letters he'd written but never sent. "I found those in your saddlebags when we brought your things in," his mother said softly from the doorway. 17 letters to your young lady in Montana. Why didn't you send them, James?" He sank on the edge of the bed, his injured arm throbbing, and picked up the top letter with his good hand. He'd written it just days before Chickamauga, when the sounds of battle were already rumbling in the distance like thunder. "My dearest Clara," it began, "I don't know if I'll live through what's coming. The Confederates are gathering for what promises to be a terrible fight, and I can feel death hanging over this place like a shroud." "I couldn't send them," James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not letters like these. She shouldn't have to read about the things I've seen, the things I've done. She shouldn't have to carry that burden." Margaret came into the room and sat beside him on the bed, her hand gentle on his uninjured arm. "Son, that young woman is waiting for you. Your father and I have received 3 letters from her since you've been gone, asking if we've heard from you, begging us to tell her that you're safe. She loves you, James. Don't you think she has a right to know that you're safe?" James shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the letter in his hands. "I'm not the same man that left here 7 months ago, Mama. The war, it changes you. It takes pieces of your soul and doesn't give them back. Clara fell in love with someone that doesn't exist anymore. That's not true, isn't it?" James looked up at his mother, and for the first time she saw the full extent of the damage the war had done to her son. His eyes, once warm and full of laughter, now held shadows that seemed to go on forever. "I've killed men, Mama. I've watched boys die calling for their mothers. I've seen things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. How can I go back to Clara with blood on my hands? How can I ask her to love someone who's done the things I've done?"
Margaret Callahan had raised 4 sons, had buried one in infancy, and seen another die of fever when he was 12. She lived through droughts and floods, Indian raids, and economic hardship. She was not a woman who was easily shaken, but seeing the pain in her youngest son's eyes, hearing the self-loathing in his voice, nearly broke her heart. "James Michael Callahan," she said firmly, "you listen to me. War is hell and it asks terrible things of good men. But surviving it, doing what you had to do to come home alive, that doesn't make you a monster. That makes you a soldier who did his duty. You don't understand. I understand more than you think." Her voice softened. "Your brother Robert came home from the Mexican War 15 years ago, and he had the same look in his eyes that you have now. He thought he was too damaged, too changed to deserve love and happiness. It took him 2 years and the patience of a good woman to realize that the war had marked him, but not destroyed him." James was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands. What if Clara takes one look at me and realizes that the man she fell in love with is gone? What if she sees what I've become and decides she can't love this version of me? "Then she is not the woman I think she is," Margaret said simply. "But James, you'll never know unless you give her the chance to decide for herself. And more importantly, you'll never give yourself the chance to heal." That evening, James sat on the front porch of his family's home, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon and thinking about another porch, another sunset, and a young woman with green eyes and auburn hair who had promised to wait for him. The sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, and James remembered how Clara had looked standing on her porch that last evening, how the light had caught in her hair, how her hand had felt in his. He pulled out paper and pen, items his mother had quietly left beside his chair, and began to write. "My dearest Clara, I know it has been many weeks since you heard from me, and I pray that this letter finds you well and not too angry with me for my silence. I was wounded at Chickamauga in September, nothing life-threatening, but enough to send me home to recover.
I am writing this from my parents' ranch in Texas, where the sunsets remind me of the evening we said goodbye. I have written you 17 letters that I never sent, letters full of the darkness and horror of war. I convinced myself that you were better off not knowing the terrible things I had seen and done, that you deserved to remember me as I was when I left Montana, not as what the war has made me. But my mother, in her wisdom, has reminded me that love is not something to be rationed or withheld out of misguided protection. If you love me, as I believed you did, then you deserve the truth, even if that truth is difficult. The war has changed me, Clara. I am not the same man who kissed you goodbye under the Montana stars. I carry scars now, both visible and hidden, and I am not sure that I am worthy of the love of someone as pure and good as you. I have done things that I pray you will never have to do, seen things that I hope you will never have to see. I don't know if I have the right to ask you to wait for someone who may never fully heal from what he has experienced. I don't know if I have the right to ask you to love a man who sometimes wakes in the night calling out from nightmares he can't escape. But I'm asking anyway, because you are the one bright star that guided me through the darkest nights of my life, and the thought of you is what kept me alive when dying would have been easier. If you can find it in your heart to forgive my silence, to accept what I have become, then I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love. But if you cannot, if the man I am now is too different from the man who left you, then I will understand. I remain, as always, completely and eternally yours, James. As he finished writing the letter, he held it in his hands and stared at the words that had poured from his heart. For a moment, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months, hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. Perhaps his mother was right. Perhaps love was stronger than the darkness that war had brought into his heart. But then he looked at the letter again, really looked at it, and saw what Clara would see. A broken man confessing his wounds and failures, asking her to accept someone who might never fully heal. The hope flickered and died like a candle in a strong wind. What right did he have to burden her with his darkness? What right did he have to ask her to wait for someone who might never be whole again? Clara Thompson deserved better than a damaged soldier who woke screaming in the night and jumped at sudden sounds. She deserved someone who could give her the uncomplicated love she had always believed in. With shaking hands, James folded the letter and placed it with the others. 18 now, instead of 17. 18 letters that spoke of love and loss, of hope and despair, of a man trying to find his way back to the light. 18 letters that would never be sent. For the first time since Chickamauga, James Callahan allowed himself to believe that perhaps the kindest thing he could do for Clara Thompson was to let her believe he was dead. Let her mourn him as the man he had been, not struggle to love the broken remnant he had become. The 18 unsent letters remained on his bedside table, a reminder of the love he had been afraid to burden her with. Tomorrow, he would begin the slow process of learning to live with what the war had done to him, and learning to live without her. Tonight, he would dream of Montana sunsets and try to find the strength to let go of the woman who waited for him there. Chapter 5. Time and Silence. Spring 1866, Montana Territory. 3 years had passed since James Callahan rode away into the Montana darkness, and Clara Thompson had grown into a woman the community hardly recognized. At 26, she possessed a quiet strength that came from years of managing a farm largely on her own, making decisions that would have challenged men twice her age, and surviving disappointments that would have broken lesser spirits. The girl who had once waited anxiously by the window for letters had evolved into someone who commanded respect at the local grange meetings, who negotiated fair prices for her cattle at market, and who could repair a broken plow as efficiently as any blacksmith in the territory. Her hands, once soft and delicate, now bore the calluses of honest labor. Her face, though still beautiful, had acquired the weathered dignity that came from facing life's hardships without flinching. But despite all her growth and independence, Clara still kept a wooden box of letters on her bedside table, and sometimes, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, she would read them by lamplight and remember what it felt like to be loved. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Samuel Morrison riding up the path on his bay gelding, his Sunday clothes immaculate despite the dust of the road. At 28, Samuel had grown into a prosperous businessman who owned not only the mercantile, but also had investments in a silver mine and several cattle ranches. He was precisely the kind of man that mothers in the territory dreamed their daughters would marry. Clara suppressed a sigh as she pinned her father's shirt to the line. Samuel had been calling on her regularly for over a year now, despite her polite but firm refusals of his advances. He was a good man, kind, steady, financially secure, but Clara felt nothing more than mild friendship for him. The problem was that Samuel Morrison was not James Callahan, and her heart seemed incapable of accepting any substitute. "Good morning, Clara," Samuel said, dismounting and removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "You're looking lovely as always." "Good morning, Samuel." Clara continued hanging laundry, not pausing in her work. "If you're looking for father, he's in the barn checking on the new calf." "Actually, I came to see you." Samuel stepped closer, his expression serious. "I was hoping we could have a conversation." Clara's heart sank. She recognized that tone, that particular combination of determination and nervousness that meant Samuel was working up his courage for another proposal. "Samuel, if this is about what I think it's about, I've already given you my answer, several times." "That was before," Samuel said, his jaw set with resolve. "Clara, it's been 3 years since James Callahan left. 3 years without a single word. Don't you think it's time to accept that he's not coming back?" The words hit Clara like physical blows, even though she'd heard variations of them countless times over the past year. The entire community seemed to have reached the same conclusion. James was dead, and Clara was wasting her life waiting for a ghost. "Even if that's true," Clara said quietly, not looking at Samuel, "it doesn't mean I'm ready to marry someone else." "But when will you be ready?" Samuel's voice carried a note of frustration that he rarely allowed to show. "How many more years are you going to spend alone, Clara? You're 26 years old. Most women your age already have children, homes of their own. I can give you all of that." Clara turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with the mixture of sadness and irritation. "What if I don't want to be given those things, Samuel? What if I want to earn them with someone I actually love?" "Love," Samuel said the word as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Clara, I've loved you for over 2 years now. I've been patient, respectful, understanding. I've waited while you held on hope for a man who's probably been dead since 1863. How long is my love supposed to count for nothing?" The pain in his voice made Clara's heart ache, but not in the way Samuel hoped. She felt genuine sorrow for hurting this good man, but she couldn't manufacture feelings that simply weren't there. "I never asked you to wait for me. I never encouraged your feelings or made you promises I couldn't keep. You chose to hope for something I couldn't give you, and I'm sorry for that. But I won't marry a man I don't love just because it would be convenient or expected." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of another rider approaching interrupted their conversation. Clara looked up to see Dr. Mitchell dismounting from his horse, his medical bag in hand, and his usually cheerful face wearing an expression of concern. "Good morning, Clara, Samuel," Dr. Mitchell said, nodding to both of them. "Clara, I came to check on your father. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he's been having some difficulty with his breathing again." Clara's attention immediately shifted from Samuel to the doctor. Her father's health had improved dramatically since his near-fatal fever 3 years ago, but lately he'd been struggling with a persistent cough that worried her. "He's in the barn," she said, already starting in that direction. "The cough has been worse at night, and yesterday he seemed short of breath after walking to the creek." As they walked toward the barn, Samuel fell into step beside them, his marriage proposal temporarily forgotten in the face of a more immediate concern.
They found William Thompson sitting on a bale of hay, breathing heavily after what should have been the simple task of checking on their livestock. At 55, he looked older than his years, his hair completely white now, and his face bearing the lines of someone who had fought hard battles against illness and time. They found William Thompson sitting on a bale of hay, breathing heavily after what should have been the simple task of checking on their livestock. At 55, he looked older than his years, his hair completely white now, and his face bearing the lines of someone who had fought hard battles against illness and time. "Hello, Doc," William said, attempting a smile. "Clara's been fussing over me like a mother hen. I keep telling her it's just the change of seasons affecting my lungs." Dr. Mitchell knelt beside William and began his examination, listening to his breathing and checking his pulse. Clara watched anxiously, memories of her father's previous illness flooding back with terrifying clarity. After several minutes, Dr. Mitchell straightened up, his expression carefully neutral. "William, I'm going to be straight with you. Your heart is working harder than it should be, and your lungs aren't clearing properly. I don't think this is just seasonal congestion." "What are you saying, Doc?" William's voice was steady, but Clara could see the fear in his eyes. "I'm saying you need to take things easier. No more heavy lifting, no more long days in the fields, and Clara?" Dr. Mitchell turned to her with a serious expression. "You're going to need help running this place. It's too much for one person, especially with your father needing more care." The implications of the doctor's words hit Clara like a thunderbolt. If her father couldn't work the farm, if she couldn't manage it alone, what would happen to everything they'd built? How could she possibly afford to hire help on the small income they earned from their modest operation? "I could help," Samuel said quietly. "Clara, if you'll let me, I could arrange for some of my men to help with the heavy work. Or," he paused, seeming to gather his courage, "or you could marry me, and then it would all be academic. My resources would be your resources." She stared at him, recognizing the calculated nature of his offer as she appreciated the genuine concern behind it. Samuel Morrison was not the kind of man who would deliberately take advantage of a crisis, but he was practical enough to recognize an opportunity when he saw one. "I need to think," Clara said finally. "I need time to figure out what's best for Father, for the farm, for all of us." After Dr. Mitchell left with instructions for William's care, and Samuel departed with the promise to check on them again soon,
Clara found herself alone with her father in the parlor. The weight of their situation pressed down on her like a physical burden. "You should marry him," William said quietly, surprising her with his directness. "Father, Clara, I'm not going to live forever. This illness isn't going away, and we both know it. When I'm gone, what's going to happen to you? How are you going to manage this place alone?" Clara felt tears threatening, but she fought them back. "I've been managing it mostly alone for 3 years. I can continue to do so." "Not if my health continues to decline. Not if you have to spend your days caring for an invalid instead of working the farm." William reached out and took her hand. "Samuel Morrison is a good man. He's prosperous, stable, and he loves you. You could do much worse." "But I don't love him, Father. Doesn't that matter?" William was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the land they'd worked so hard to maintain. "Love matters, Clara, but so does security. So does having someone to share the burdens of life with. Sometimes practical considerations have to outweigh romantic ideals." That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, as she had so many nights before, but instead of writing a letter to James, she stared at a blank piece of paper and tried to figure out how to solve the impossible puzzle her life had become. Marry Samuel and gain security, but lose the possibility of true love. Remain unmarried and risk losing everything if her father's health continued to decline. Outside her window, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Somewhere beyond those distant mountains, James Callahan might be dead in an unmarked grave, or he might be building a new life with someone else, or he might be struggling with demons that made it impossible for him to come home. Clara had waited 3 years for answers that never came. The question now was whether she could afford to wait any longer, or whether the time had come to accept that some dreams were meant to remain unfulfilled. She folded the blank paper and put it away without writing a single word. Some decisions, she realized, couldn't be made in the space of a single evening. They required the kind of careful consideration that came only with time and prayer and the honest acknowledgement of one's limitations. But as she prepared for bed that night, Clara made one decision with absolute certainty. Whatever choice she ultimately made about her future, it would be her choice. Made for her reasons, she would not be pressured into marriage by well-meaning neighbors or frightened into it by circumstances beyond her control. She had grown too strong, become too independent to surrender her agency now. Whatever came next, she would face it as the woman she had become, not as the girl she had once been. Chapter 6. A Stranger Comes to Town. Late spring 1866, Montana Territory. The stranger rode into town on a gray morning when the clouds hung low over the mountains like smoke from a distant fire. He sat tall in the saddle despite the slight favor he showed his left arm, his dark hat pulled low over his face, and his clothes bearing the dust of many miles traveled. To the casual observer, he was just another drifter passing through, perhaps a former soldier looking for work or a man running from something he'd rather forget. But James Callahan was running toward something, not away from it. After 3 years of healing, of learning to live with the nightmares that still visited him in the dark hours before dawn, of finding the courage to believe he might be worthy of love again, he had finally come home to Montana Territory. Home to find Clara Thompson and discover if the promise they'd made under the stars so long ago still meant something to either of them. He had changed dramatically in the years since he'd left. The boy who'd ridden off to war with dreams of glory and quick victory had been replaced by a man who understood that some victories came at too high a price, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply survive. His face was leaner now, marked by lines that spoke of pain endured and wisdom earned. His left shoulder bore the permanent reminder of Confederate shrapnel, and his hands carried scars from a dozen minor wounds. But perhaps most significantly, his eyes held depths that hadn't been there before, shadows and understanding that only came from looking into the face of mortality and choosing to keep living anyway. James had spent the better part of 2 days in the hills outside town, watching, learning, trying to understand what had changed in his absence. He'd seen Clara from a distance, working in her garden behind the farmhouse, and the sight of her had nearly driven him to his knees. She was more beautiful than his memories had allowed him to believe. Not the soft beauty of the 23-year-old girl he'd left behind, but the elegant strength of a woman who had faced life's challenges and emerged victorious. But he'd also seen Samuel Morrison riding up to the Thompson farm with the confident posture of a man who felt he belonged there. He'd watched from his hiding place in the trees as Morrison and Clara stood together by the clothesline, their conversation intense and intimate in a way that made James' chest tighten with something that might have been jealousy or might have been fear. Now, as he guided his horse down the main street of the town he'd once known so well, James felt like a ghost returning to a world that had moved on without him. The general store where Clara used to buy supplies looked the same, but there was a new addition on the side. Probably Samuel Morrison's work, improving his investment. The church where James had planned to marry Clara someday had a fresh coat of white paint and a new bell tower. Everything was familiar yet different, like a song he'd once known well but couldn't quite remember the melody to anymore. James dismounted in front of the saloon more because he needed a moment to steady his nerves than because he wanted a drink. His hands shook slightly as he tied his horse to the hitching post, not from fear of battle, which he'd learned to manage, but much more terrifying prospect of facing the woman he'd loved and lost through his own cowardice. "You're new in town." The voice came from behind him, and James turned to see a man about his own age with shrewd eyes and clothes that spoke of prosperity. Samuel Morrison, though James didn't know the name yet, extended his hand in greeting. "Just passing through," James replied, accepting the handshake and noting the soft quality of Morrison's palm, the hands of a man who worked with ledgers rather than livestock. "Samuel Morrison. I own the Mercantile and a few other businesses around here." Morrison's smile was genuine, but his eyes were assessing James with the keen attention of a man who made his living reading people. "If you're looking for work, there's always need for good hands on the ranches." "I appreciate that," James said carefully. "Name's Jake Collins." The false name came easily. He'd been using it for months during his slow journey west, not ready to be James Callahan until he'd decided what kind of man James Callahan was going to be. "Well, Jake, welcome to our little corner of Montana. It's not much to look at, but it's home." Morrison paused, then added with casual curiosity, "You have the look of a soldier about you. See action in the war?" James stiffened almost imperceptibly. Even after all this time, talking about the war was like probing an infected wound. "Some," he said simply. Morrison nodded understandingly. "A lot of boys came back changed. My advice is to put it behind you and focus on building something new. That's what this territory is all about, fresh starts." Before James could respond, the sound of a wagon approaching drew both men's attention. James' breath caught in his throat as he saw Clara Thompson driving down the main street, sitting straight-backed on the wagon seat with the basket of eggs beside her, probably headed to the general store to trade for supplies. She was even more beautiful up close than she had been from a distance. Her auburn hair was pinned back practically, but a few rebellious strands caught the morning light like fire. Her green eyes were focused on managing her horses, but there was a quiet confidence in her movements that spoke of someone who had learned to depend entirely on herself. "Ah, there's Miss Thompson," Morrison said, and James heard the change in his voice, a warmth and possessiveness that made James' jaw clench with something that might have been jealousy or might have been fear. "One of the finest women in the territory. Runs her family's farm almost single-handedly since her father took ill." Clara pulled up in front of the mercantile and began to climb down from the wagon. James found himself moving automatically to help her, his gentleman's instincts overriding his caution. "Allow me, miss," he said, extending his hand to assist her down. Clara looked up at him, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met. James saw confusion flicker across her features, not recognition, but something deeper, a sense of familiarity that she couldn't quite place, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting his assistance. Her gloved hands was warm in his, and James had to fight the urge to hold on longer than propriety allowed. "Clara, let me introduce Jake Collins," Morrison said, moving closer with a slight possessive air that wasn't lost on James. "Jake, this is Miss Clara Thompson." "Miss Thompson." James touched the brim of his hat, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he said more. Clara studied his face with those intelligent green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. "Have we met before, Mr. Collins? You seem familiar somehow." James' heart hammered against his ribs. Even after all the changes the war had wrought in him, some part of her still recognized some part of him. "I don't believe so, miss. I would certainly remember meeting someone as lovely as yourself." A faint blush colored Clara's cheeks, but she continued to study him with that puzzled expression. "Are you from around here originally? Perhaps I knew your family?" "No, ma'am. I'm from down Texas way. Just passing through, looking for work." "Well, if you're looking for honest employment, the Thompson farm could use a good hand," Clara said, surprising both men. "My father's health isn't what it used to be, and there's more work than I can manage alone." Morrison's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Clara, you don't know anything about this man. It might not be wise." "Clara, I'm a good judge of character, Samuel. And we do need the help." She turned back to James. "The work is hard and I can't pay much, but there's a small cabin behind the barn where you could stay, and meals come with the job." James stared at her, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't begin to name. Here was the opportunity he dreamed of, a chance to be near Clara, to see for himself what kind of woman she'd become, to decide whether he had the courage to reveal his true identity. "That's very generous, Miss Thompson. I'd be grateful for the work." "Good. Can you start tomorrow? There's fence that needs mending, and we're getting ready for spring planting." "Yes, ma'am." Clara smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from her, and it was like watching the sun come up after the longest night of his life. "Excellent. Come by around dawn. I'll show you around the place and explain what needs doing." As Clara gathered her basket and headed into the mercantile, James caught Morrison's arm before the man could follow her. "She's not wearing a ring," James observed quietly. Morrison's expression hardened. "Miss Thompson is particular about her commitments, but I have reason to hope that will change soon." James nodded slowly, understanding the warning in Morrison's tone. "I see. Well, I'm just looking for honest work, nothing more." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. He was looking for much more than work. He was looking for redemption, for the possibility of reclaiming a future he thought lost forever, for the chance to discover whether love could survive the kinds of changes that war inflicted on a man's soul. That night, as James made camp in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek that ran behind the Thompson property, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Clara hadn't recognized him, but she'd felt something, some echo of their old connection. She'd offered him work, offered him a chance to be part of his life again, even if she didn't know that's what she was doing. Tomorrow he would start the delicate, dangerous work of trying to win back the woman he'd never stopped loving. He would do it slowly, carefully, giving her time to know the man he'd become before revealing the boy he'd once been. As he settled into his bedroll, James whispered a prayer to a God he thought had abandoned him on the battlefields of Tennessee. Let her love me again. Let me be worthy of it this time. In the distance, he could see the warm glow of lamplight in the windows of the Thompson farmhouse, and he imagined Clara sitting at her kitchen table, perhaps writing in a journal or reading before bed. He didn't yet know that in that same kitchen, Clara was staring out the window in his direction, unable to shake the feeling that the stranger who'd helped her down from her wagon was somehow the most important person who had ever entered her life. Chapter 7. Undelivered Letters. James had been working on the Thompson farm for 2 weeks when he first glimpsed the wooden box. He'd been repairing the fence line that bordered the creek, honest work that felt good after 3 years of uncertainty and wandering. Clara had proven to be a fair employer. She worked as hard as any man, knew every inch of the property, and possessed an intuitive understanding of livestock and land management that impressed even someone with James's ranching background. She was also, he'd noticed with growing admiration, scrupulously careful to maintain proper boundaries between employer and employee. But sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, James caught Clara studying him with that same puzzled expression she'd worn the day they met, as if she were trying to solve a riddle that stayed just beyond her grasp. On this particular morning, James had come to the main house to report that the creek fence was finished and to ask about his next assignment. He knocked on the kitchen door as was proper, but when no one answered, he pushed it open slightly and called out, "Miss Thompson? Mr. Thompson? It's Jake Collins." "In here, Jake," came Clara's voice from upstairs. "Father had a difficult night. I'll be down in a moment." James stepped into the kitchen to wait, and that's when he saw it. A wooden box sitting open on the kitchen table, and scattered around it, letters. Even from across the room, even after 3 years, James recognized his own handwriting. His heart stopped. Moving closer despite knowing he was invading Clara's privacy, James saw that every letter he'd ever sent her was there, carefully preserved and obviously frequently read. The paper showed signs of gentle handling, the folds worn soft from repeated opening and closing. Some letters had what looked like tear stains on them. With trembling hands, James picked up the letter on top, the last one he sent, dated July 1863. His own words, written from that sweltering camp in Tennessee, stared back at him. "My darling Clara, the heat here is unbearable and the fighting has been fierce. We lost good men at Chickamauga, but by God's grace, I remain unharmed. Your letters are my lifeline, dear one. When I read your words about the farm, about your father's improving health, about the simple beauty of sunsets in Montana, I remember what I'm fighting to return to." James's vision blurred. She had kept them all, every single letter, treasured like precious relics. While he had been torturing himself with guilt and self-doubt in Texas, while he had been convincing himself that she was better off without him, Clara had been here, holding on to every word he'd ever written to her. "Jake?" James spun around, the letter still in his hand, to find Clara standing in the kitchen doorway. Her face went pale when she saw what he was holding, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture of pure mortification. "I'm sorry," James said quickly, setting the letter down with infinite care. "I called out, and when no one answered, I came in to wait. I didn't mean to." "Please don't." Clara's voice was barely a whisper, and she moved quickly to the table, gathering the letters as if trying to hide evidence of some shameful secret. "Miss Thompson, I didn't read anything beyond, 'They're from someone who's dead,'" Clara said abruptly, her hands shaking as she tried to reorganize the letters. "Someone who died in the war. I know it's foolish to keep them, but I—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. And James saw tears beginning to form in her green eyes. The sight of her pain that he had caused through his cowardice and silence, nearly drove him to his knees. "It's not foolish," he said gently. "Love doesn't die just because the person does. There's no shame in holding on to something that meant so much to you." Clara looked up at him, and for a moment, James thought he might see through his disguise to the truth beneath. But then she simply nodded and finished gathering the letters into their box. "Thank you for understanding. Most people think I should have moved on by now." "Most people don't know what it's like to love someone that deeply." The words were out before James could stop them, and Clara studied his face with renewed curiosity. "You sound as if you speak from experience, Jake." There was someone, once, before the war." "What happened to her?" "I let her go," James said quietly, the truth of it cutting through him like a knife. Before Clara could respond, a commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, James could see 3 men on horseback driving a small group of cattle toward the road, cattle that bore the Thompson brand. "What in blazes?" Clara started toward the window, but James was already moving. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. But Clara Thompson had not spent 3 years running a farm alone when trouble came calling. She followed James onto the porch, where they could see the situation more clearly. The 3 men were rough-looking characters that James didn't recognize from town. The leader, a man with a scraggly beard and hard eyes, was directing his companions to drive the cattle faster. These weren't neighbors helping with the roundup. This was theft, plain and simple. "Hey!" Clara called out, starting down the porch steps. "Though they're my cattle." The bearded man turned his horse toward the house, and James saw his hand move toward the gun at his hip. Without thinking, James stepped in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. "Ma'am, I suggest you go back inside and forget what you saw," the rustler called out. "We're just taking what we're owed." "Owed?" Clara tried to step around James, but he kept himself positioned between her and the threat. "I don't owe you anything." "Your neighbor Morrison does, and he suggested we might find suitable payment right here." James felt Clara go rigid behind him. Samuel Morrison, suggesting that rustlers take Clara's cattle as payment for some debt? It didn't make sense, unless... Morrison doesn't have any claim on these cattle or this land, James said, his voice deadly calm. The rustler's eyes narrowed. And who might you be, stranger? Someone who doesn't like seeing innocent people robbed. The man's hand moved closer to his weapon. Well, stranger, unless you want to end up face down in the dirt, I suggest you mind your own business. James felt the familiar, cold clarity that had kept him alive through 2 years of war settle over him. His own gun was tucked into his belt, hidden beneath his shirt, and he calculated distances and angles with the automatic precision of someone who had faced death many times before. Clara, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the rustler, go back in the house, now. I won't leave you to... Go, inside, now. Something in his tone, perhaps the voice of the soldier he'd once been, rather than the drifter he was pretending to be, made Clara obey. James heard the kitchen door close behind him just as the rustler decided to make his play. The man went for his gun with the confident speed of someone who had intimidated many defenseless farmers and townspeople, but he was facing James Callahan, late of the Army of the Tennessee, veteran of Shiloh and Stones River and Chickamauga. James's weapon cleared leather and fired before the rustlers had even cleared its holster. The shot echoed across the peaceful Montana valley like thunder, and the rustler pitched sideways from his horse, clutching his shoulder. His two companions, seeing their leader down and facing a man who clearly knew how to handle himself in a fight, decided that Thompson cattle weren't worth dying for. "This ain't over," one of them shouted, as they wheeled their horses and fled, abandoning the stolen cattle. James kept his gun trained on the wounded rustler until he was certain the man posed no further threat, then moved to secure the man's weapon. Only then did he allow Clara to emerge from the house. She ran to him with tears in her eyes, and before James could react, she threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "If you hadn't have been here..." James held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his, and for a moment he forgot everything except how perfectly she fit in his arms. It was as if no time had passed, as if they were still the young couple who had said goodbye under the Montana stars 3 years ago. But then reality intruded. Clara pulled back slightly, looking up into his face with an expression of dawning recognition. "Your eyes," she whispered. "I know those eyes." James felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. The way he'd moved, the way he'd handled the weapon, the way he protected her, it was too familiar, too much like the James Callahan she had once known. "Jake Collins, you said your name was, but that's not true, is it?" James stared down into those beautiful green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years and knew that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. He could continue the deception, could make up some story about why he seemed familiar, but looking at Clara's face, seeing the hope beginning to bloom there alongside the recognition, he knew he couldn't lie to her anymore. "No," he said quietly, "it's not true." Clara's hands came up to frame his face, her fingers tracing the new lines around his eyes, the scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before. "James..." The name came out as barely a breath. James Callahan? Hello, Clara. The wooden box of letters sat forgotten on the kitchen table, but James no longer needed to read them to know that Clara had never stopped loving him. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her hands trembled as they touched his face, and in the way she said his name like a prayer answered. In his saddlebags, hidden in the small cabin behind the barn, 18 letters waited. Letters he had written but never sent, letters that spoke of love and loss and the long journey back to hope. Soon, he would share those with her as well. But for now, it was enough to hold Clara Thompson in his arms again and know that some promises, some loves, were strong enough to survive even the darkness of war. Chapter 8. The First Confession. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Clara with her hands still framing James's face, and James with his heart hammering against his ribs as if he were facing enemy fire once again. The wounded wrestler groaned from where he lay in the dirt, but neither of them paid him any attention. The rest of the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, and 3 years of silence that hung between them like an unbridged chasm. "James," Clara whispered again, and this time there was no question in her voice, only certainty and a pain so deep it made James want to gather her close and promise that he would never hurt her again. But he couldn't make that promise. Not yet. Not until she knew the whole truth. "We need to deal with him first," James said quietly. Nodding toward the rustler who was trying to stem the bleeding from his shoulder wound. Clara blinked, as if returning to the present moment from somewhere far away. Yes, of course." Her voice sounded strange, distant, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. They tied up the wounded man and loaded him into Clara's wagon. The ride to town was conducted in absolute silence, both of them too overwhelmed by the revelation to attempt conversation. James could feel Clara watching him from the corner of her eye, studying his profile as if trying to memorize every change the years had wrought. At the sheriff's office, James gave his statement as Jake Collins, the drifter who had happened to be working at the Thompson farm when the rustling occurred. Sheriff Murphy, a grizzled man in his 50s who had known James's family before the war, looked at him with curious eyes but didn't press for details beyond what was necessary for his report. "Strange coincidence," the sheriff commented, as he wrote, "Rustlers hitting the Thompson place just when Miss Clara here had hired herself some protection." "Lucky. Coincidence," James corrected. "Lucky indeed." Sheriff Murphy's eyes lingered on James's face for a moment longer than necessary. "You know, son, you remind me of someone. Can't quite place who, though." "I get that sometimes. Folks say I have one of those faces." The ride back to the farm was as silent as the journey into town had been, but the quality of the silence had changed. Where before it had been shocked and uncertain, now it thrummed with unspoken questions and barely contained emotion. It wasn't until they were back at the farm, the horses unhitched and cared for, that Clara finally spoke. 3 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years, James. 3 years of not knowing if you were alive or dead. 3 years of wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd failed you somehow. James felt each word like a physical blow. "Clara, you never—" "No." She held up a hand to stop him, her green eyes blazing with the mixture of hurt and anger that James had never seen there before. "You don't get to speak yet. You had 3 years to find words and you chose silence. Now it's my turn." James nodded, understanding that he deserved whatever she was about to say to him. Clara began to pace the length of the front porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Do you have any idea what it's like to love someone who disappears? To go to sleep every night not knowing if the man you gave your heart to is sleeping under the same stars or lying dead in some unmarked grave?" "Clara, I said it's my turn." The words came out sharp enough to cut glass. "For 3 years, James Callahan, I have lived in limbo. Not married, not widowed, not free to move on and not able to let go. Do you know what people called me? The woman too foolish to accept reality. The spinster who chose to love a ghost rather than accept a flesh and blood man." James winced. He could imagine the whispers, the well-meaning advice, the pressure she must have faced. "Samuel Morrison has asked me to marry me 6 times, James. 6 times. A good man, a stable man, a man who was here when you were not. And 6 times I said no. Because somewhere in my foolish heart, I believed you would come back to me." "You were right to believe that," James said quietly. Clara whirled to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Was I? Was I really? Because the James Callahan who loved me wouldn't have let me suffer for 3 years. The James Callahan who kissed me goodbye under the Montana stars wouldn't have let me wonder and worry and waste away waiting for someone who might never return." The pain in her voice was unbearable. James took a step toward her, but Clara backed away, shaking her head. "How long have you been back, James? How long have you been in Montana watching me while I went on believing you were dead or forgotten me entirely?" 2 weeks. "I've been working here for 2 weeks." 2 weeks. Clara's laugh was bitter and broken. 2 weeks you've been here watching me grieve for you, watching me struggle with decisions about my future, and you said nothing? You let me offer my heart to Samuel Morrison out of desperation and loneliness, and you said nothing. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," James said desperately. "I didn't know if the man that I've become was someone you could love." "That wasn't your choice to make." Clara's voice rose to nearly a shout. "That was my choice, James, my choice to make, and you stole it from me, just like you stole 3 years of my life." James felt something break inside his chest. I know I did, and I'm sorry. Clara, I'm so sorry. But I was broken. The war, it changed me in ways I can't even begin to explain. I convinced myself that you deserved better than what I had become. Better than what? Better than the truth? Better than knowing that the man I loved was alive and struggling? Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but the tears kept coming. "Do you think I'm such a fragile flower that I couldn't have handled knowing you were hurt? Do you think my love was so shallow that a few scars would have frightened me away? No, but then why, James? Why did you choose to let me suffer in silence rather than trust me with the truth?" James sank down onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. How could he explain the darkness that had consumed him after Chickamauga? How could he make her understand the depths of his self-loathing, the certainty that he was no longer worthy of her love? "I killed people, Clara," he said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. "Boys, some of them. Boys who were somebody's sons, somebody's sweethearts. I watched good men die screaming for their mothers. I did things, terrible things, that I can't take back and can't forget." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when James looked up, he saw that she had stopped pacing and was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "And you thought that would matter to me?" she asked softly. "I thought it should matter to you." Clara moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "James, look at me." Reluctantly, he raised his head. "You think you're the only man who came back from that war carrying darkness? My brother Tom came home 6 months ago. Do you know what he told me? He told me that war turns good men into killers because that's what survival requires. He told me that the real tragedy isn't what soldiers do in war, it's what they do to themselves afterward." James stared at her, hardly daring to hope. "Tom has nightmares," Clara continued. "He wakes up screaming some nights, calling out names of men who died in his arms. But he's still my brother, James. He's still the boy who taught me to fish and helped me gather eggs and protected me from everything that frightened me when we were children. War marked him, but it didn't destroy who he is at his core. Clara, I don't care what you did in that war. I don't care what you had to become to survive. What I care about is that you came home, and then you chose to stay away. What I care about is that you let me believe you were dead when you were very much alive." James rose from the steps and moved toward her, his heart in his throat. "Can you forgive me? Can you ever forgive me for what I put you through?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if looking for something she'd lost and found again. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty of it cut deeper than any accusation could have. "I love you, James. I've never stopped loving you. But love and forgiveness aren't the same thing. Trust and forgiveness aren't the same thing." James nodded, understanding. "What can I do? How can I earn your forgiveness?" "I don't know that either. I need time, James. Time to understand what this means, what we are to each other now. Time to decide if the love we had can survive what we've both become." "I'll wait," James said immediately. "However long it takes, I'll wait." Clara's smile was sad and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. "That's what I was afraid you'd say. Because I've been waiting for 3 years, and I'm tired of waiting. I don't want promises about the future. I don't want pretty words about what might be. I want to know who you are now, today, this moment. I want to know if James Callahan can be trusted to stay, or if he's going to disappear again the moment things get difficult." As the sun began to set behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded James of that night, 3 years ago, when he'd first kissed Clara goodbye, he realized that winning back her love was going to be the hardest battle he'd ever fought. But unlike the war that had taken so much from him, this was a battle worth fighting. This time he wouldn't retreat. This time he would stand and face whatever came, Because Clara Thompson was worth any amount of courage it might take to prove himself worthy of her love again. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not ever again." Clara studied his face in the fading light, and James could see the war between hope and fear playing out in her beautiful eyes. "We'll see," she said finally. "We'll see."
Chapter 9. The Weight of the Past. The following morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the Montana sky itself reflected the heaviness that had settled between James and Clara. She found him already at work, repairing the gate to the cattle pen with methodical precision, his movements careful and controlled despite the steady rain that had begun before dawn. Clara watched him from the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast for her father, noting how James favored his left shoulder, how he paused occasionally as if listening for sounds that only he could hear. The man working in her yard was both completely familiar and utterly foreign. The hands were the same hands that had once held hers, but they moved with a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned in the worst possible ways. When she brought him coffee and a plate of eggs and biscuits, James looked up with eyes that held the shadows of a sleepless night. "Thank you," he said quietly, accepting the food with gratitude that went deeper than mere politeness. Clara settled onto a nearby stump, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "You didn't sleep." It wasn't a question. James's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and she could see the fine tremor in his hands that spoke of someone fighting battles even in his dreams. "The nightmares?" James nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke about the images that haunted his sleeping hours. The faces of dead boys, the screams of wounded horses, the sound of artillery fire that seemed to echo in his skull even 3 years after the guns had fallen silent. Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain bead on the brim of his hat. "Tom told me about his dreams, about waking up thinking he was still at Antietam, still hearing the cannons. Dr. Mitchell says it's common among soldiers who've seen heavy fighting." "Dr. Mitchell is a good man, but he's never had to kill someone with his bare hands. He's never had to watch a boy bleed out in the mud while calling for his mother. He's never had to make the choice between saving his own life and saving someone else's." The raw pain in his voice made Clara's chest tighten. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but the hurt from yesterday's revelations still stood between them like a wall of thorns. "Is that why you stayed away? Because you thought I wouldn't understand?" she asked gently. James set down his coffee cup and stared at his hands. Hands that had held weapons, hands that had taken lives, hands that had held dying men as they breathed their last. "I stayed away because I knew you would try to understand, and I couldn't bear the thought of dragging you down into the darkness with me." "That wasn't your choice to make," Clara repeated her words from the previous day, but more gently this time. "Wasn't it?" James looked up at her, his coffee-colored eyes intense and pained. "Clara, you have no idea what I was like when I first came home to Texas.
I couldn't be in enclosed spaces without breaking into a cold sweat. Sudden noises made me reach for weapons that weren't there. I woke up screaming so often that my mother was afraid the neighbors would think someone was being murdered in our house. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the image of James, her James, suffering alone and afraid. My father tried to help. He'd fought in the Mexican War, thought he understood, but one night, when he shook me awake from a particularly bad nightmare, I nearly killed him. I had him pinned to the floor with my hands around his throat before I realized where I was, who he was. The horror of that revelation hung between them like a living thing. Clara could see the shame in James's posture, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes as he spoke. After that night, I knew I couldn't come back to you. Not like that. What if I hurt you, Clara? What if one night, in the grip of some nightmare, I mistook you for an enemy? What if I... His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Clara felt her resolve wavering. The anger she'd nurtured through the long, sleepless night began to crack around the edges as she saw the depth of his anguish. But alongside her compassion rose a terrible fear. Was James right? Was he too damaged, too dangerous to be the man she'd once loved? "How do I know you're better now?" she asked, hating herself for the question but needing to ask it anyway. "How do I know that won't happen again?" James was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the sound of the rain. "I don't know that it won't," he admitted. "I can't promise you that I'm healed because I'm not sure that kind of healing is possible. But I can promise you that I've learned to manage it. I can promise you that I would rather die than hurt you." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. Love James and risk the possibility of danger, of more heartbreak, of discovering that some wounds cut too deep to heal. Or protect herself, build a safe life with Samuel Morrison, and always wonder what might have been. "The whole town is talking about us, about Jake Collins, the mysterious stranger who saved Clara Thompson from rustlers and then disappeared with her into her house for hours." James's mouth quirked in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "What are they saying?" "Mrs. Patterson thinks you're either my secret lover or a desperado planning to rob me blind. Mr. Henderson at the post office is convinced you're an outlaw running from the law. And Dr. Mitchell..." Clara paused, her expression growing troubled. "Dr. Mitchell asked me if you were someone from my past, come back to complicate my life." "Wise man, Dr. Mitchell." "Too wise, perhaps." Clara pulled her shawl closer. "He also mentioned that Samuel Morrison has been asking questions about you, about Jake Collins." James's expression hardened. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests he's not entirely convinced you're just a drifter looking for work." Clara met his eyes. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Those rustlers yesterday, the one you shot, said something about Morrison owing them, about taking my cattle as payment. Do you think Samuel had something to do with that attack?" James considered the question carefully. He'd been wondering the same thing since yesterday, but he hadn't wanted to voice his suspicions without proof. "He thinks," he said slowly, "that Samuel Morrison is a man who's used to getting what he wants. And I think he's not above using underhanded methods to achieve his goals. Whether that extends to cattle rustling," James shrugged, "I can't say for certain, but I intend to find out." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning rain. If Samuel was involved in yesterday's attack, if he was trying to force my hand by creating a crisis that would make me dependent on him, then he's more dangerous than either of us realized, James finished. Clara, I need you to be careful around Morrison. Don't be alone with him, don't trust him, and if he pressures you about marriage again— I can take care of myself, Clara interrupted, her spine stiffening. I've been doing it for 3 years. I know you can, but you shouldn't have to. James stood up, setting his empty plate aside. Clara, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I know I've forfeited any claim to your trust or your love, but please, let me protect you. Let me do what I should have done 3 years ago. Clara looked up at him, this man who was both her greatest love and her deepest pain, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. What are you asking me, James? I'm asking you to let me stay, not as your husband, not as your lover, but as your friend, as someone who cares about your safety and your happiness. Give me the chance to prove that I'm not the coward who ran away 3 years ago. Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the rain drip from the eaves of the barn, thinking about choices and consequences and the terrible complexity of loving someone who had been broken by forces beyond their control. The town won't understand. People are already talking. If you stay, if you continue working here, they'll assume we're involved. My reputation will suffer. Then I'll leave, James said immediately. I won't let my presence damage your standing in the community. No. The word came out more forcefully than Clara had intended. No, I'm tired of making decisions based on what other people think. I'm tired of letting fear rule my life. She stood up, facing him squarely. You can stay, James, but understand this. You're not staying for me. You're staying because it's the right thing to do, because this farm needs your help, because my father's health requires it. Not because I've forgiven you, and not because I'm ready to pick up where we left off 3 years ago. James nodded, understanding the terms she was setting. Thank you, Clara. I won't let you down. As she walked back toward the house, Clara hoped that was a promise James would be able to keep, because despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the fear, she was discovering that some loves ran too deep to be killed by time or pain or even betrayal. The question was whether love would be enough to heal the wounds that war had carved into both their hearts, or whether some damage was simply too great to overcome. Chapter 10. The Decision of the Heart. That evening, after James had retired to the small cabin behind the barn, and her father had fallen into the fitful sleep that had become his pattern, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen with the wooden box of letters. She hadn't touched them since the morning James had discovered them, hadn't been able to bring herself to read words that now felt both precious and painful. But tonight, with the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her shoulders, Clara needed to remember. She needed to understand what it was she was trying so hard to protect her heart against, and whether it was worth protecting at all. She lit the oil lamp and opened the box with trembling fingers, pulling out the first letter James had ever sent her. The paper was soft with age and handling, the ink slightly faded, but his words were as clear as if he'd written them yesterday. My darling Clara, I am writing this by firelight, in a camp full of strangers who are becoming brothers. The journey to Fort Laramie was long and dusty, but your memory made every mile bearable. I carry your image with me always, the way you looked standing on your porch that last evening, so beautiful and brave, even though I could see the fear in your green eyes. Clara's vision blurred as she remembered that night, the way James had looked at her as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face, the way his hands had trembled slightly when he'd given her his first letter, the way his kiss had tasted of promises and hope and the terrible uncertainty of goodbye. She pulled out another letter, this one written from Missouri. "We are moving quickly now, Clara. I cannot tell you exactly where, as the officers say loose talk can endanger lives, but know that every step takes me further from you and closer to whatever destiny God has planned for me. The other soldiers speak of sweethearts and wives waiting for them at home, and I am proud to tell them about the most beautiful, strongest woman in all of Montana Territory." Clara could hear James's voice in every word, could picture him sitting by a campfire somewhere in the vast darkness of a country at war, writing to her by flickering firelight while other young men wrote their own letters to their own loves. How many of those men had made it home? How many of their sweethearts had waited as Clara had waited, clinging to words on paper as if they were lifelines? The third letter made her chest tighten with remembered pain. "My dearest Clara, I have seen things now that I pray you will never have to see. The reality of war is nothing like the stories we heard back home. Men die here, good men with families and dreams just like ours. I watched a boy from Nebraska, couldn't have been more than 17, breathe his last yesterday while calling for his mother." This was where the change had begun, Clara realized. This was where the James she'd known, optimistic, confident, eager for adventure, had started to die and be replaced by someone harder, sadder, more aware of the darkness that lived in the human heart. She could trace his transformation through these letters like following a map through increasingly treacherous territory. The final letter, the one that arrived in July of 1863, felt different in her hands. The paper was slightly different, the handwriting more hurried, as if James had been writing against time itself. "Clara, my love, I am well and uninjured, though I cannot say the same for many of my fellow soldiers. We have been in 2 battles now, and by God's grace I have come through both unharmed. I think of you constantly. When I wake in the morning, I imagine you feeding the chickens and gathering eggs. When we make camp at nights, I picture you reading by lamplight in your father's chair." Clara closed her eyes, remembering how she had clung to those words during the long months of silence that followed, how she had read them over and over, searching for hidden meanings, for clues about when he might return, for reassurance that his love was still as strong as hers. But there had been no more letters, no explanation, no goodbye, no gradual fading away of affection, just sudden, complete silence that had left her suspended between hope and despair for 3 long years. Clara set the letters aside and moved to the window, looking out toward the small cabin where James was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling and fighting his own battles with memory and regret. A faint light flickered in the cabin window. He was awake, as she'd suspected. Perhaps he was reading his own letters, the 18 messages he'd written but never sent. What would those letters say? What truths had he been too afraid to share? What pain had he carried alone, rather than burden her with it? The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted her thoughts. Clara tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung beside the door. Living alone had taught her to be cautious of unexpected visitors. But then she heard a familiar voice calling softly, "Clara, it's Samuel. I saw your light was still on." Clara's heart sank. Samuel Morrison was the last person she wanted to see tonight, when her emotions were already raw and her thoughts in turmoil. But she couldn't pretend to be asleep. He'd clearly seen her moving about the kitchen. She opened the door to find Samuel standing on her porch, hat in hand, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. His eyes were bright with an intensity she'd rarely seen in him, and there was something in his posture that made her suddenly wary. "Samuel, it's quite late. Is everything all right?" "May I come in? I need to speak with you about something important." Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to refuse, to send him away and deal with whatever he had to say in the harsh light of day. But Samuel was a neighbor, had been a friend for years, and she couldn't quite bring herself to be so rude. "Of course," she said, stepping back to let him enter. Samuel moved past her into the kitchen, and Clara saw his eyes immediately go to the open box of letters on the table. His expression hardened, and when he turned back to her, there was something cold in his face that she'd never seen before. "Still reading love letters from dead men, Clara?" The cruelty in his voice took her breath away. "Samuel, do you know what people are saying about you? About your mysterious hired hand who appeared so conveniently just when you needed him most?" Samuel moved closer, and Clara found herself backing toward the door. "They're saying you've taken a lover, Clara. They're saying you're living in sin under your own father's roof." "That's not true, and you know it." "Do I? Because I've been watching your Jake Collins very carefully, and there's something familiar about him, something that doesn't quite add up." Clara's blood turned to ice in her veins. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way he moves, like a man who's seen combat. I'm talking about the way he handled those rustlers, too skilled, too confident for a simple drifter. I'm talking about the way he looks at you, Clara, like a man who's known you for years instead of weeks." Samuel was close enough now that Clara could smell whiskey on his breath, could see the dangerous glitter in his eyes that spoke of a man who had reached the end of his patience. "I know who he is, Clara." The words hit her like physical blows. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, felt her knees go weak with shock and fear. "I don't know what you think you know." "James Callahan," Samuel said, and Clara's world tilted on its axis. "Your precious lost love returned from the dead to complicate my carefully laid out plans." Clara stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the man behind the respectable facade. "Your plans? Did you really think those rustlers yesterday were a coincidence?" Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Did you think it was chance that brought them to your farm just when your father's health was failing and you were most vulnerable?" The truth hit Clara like a sledgehammer. "You arranged it. You sent those men here." "I arranged a solution to your problems," Samuel corrected. "A crisis that would have made you see reason, made you understand that you needed a strong man to protect you. A crisis that would have driven you straight into my arms, grateful for my rescue and ready to accept my proposal." Clara felt sick. "But James was here. James stopped them." "Yes, your precious James. Who would have thought the coward who abandoned you 3 years ago would finally grow a spine?" Samuel's voice turned ugly. "But it doesn't matter. Nothing has changed, Clara. You still need protection. Your father is still dying. Your farm is still too much for one woman to manage alone. I have help now. From a man who left you once and will leave you again the moment things get difficult?" Samuel shook his head. "You're more naive than I thought if you believe James Callahan has changed. He's still the same selfish boy who rode away without a word, and he'll do it again the first time his nightmares get too bad or his guilt gets too heavy." Clara felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her chest. "You don't know anything about James. I know he's damaged goods. I know he's living in that cabin out there because he's too afraid to sleep in a real house, too afraid of what he might do if someone startles him awake. I know he's carrying scars that will never heal, and I know that sooner or later, those scars are going to hurt you." Every word was calculated to wound, to plant seeds of doubt in Clara's mind. But instead of making her question her feelings for James, Samuel's attack had the opposite effect. It crystallized something inside her, made her understand with perfect clarity what she'd been struggling to accept. "Get out," she said quietly. "Clara, be reasonable. Get out of my house, Samuel, now." Samuel's expression turned dangerous. "You're making a mistake, Clara. James Callahan is never going to be the man you need him to be. He's broken, probably beyond repair, and when he breaks your heart again, and he will, don't come crying to me." "I won't," Clara said with absolute certainty. "Because whatever James has become, whatever scars he carries, whatever demons he fights, he's still the man who wrote me letters by firelight from a dozen battlefields. He's still the man who risked his life yesterday to protect me from the rustlers you sent. He's still the man I love." The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, and Clara could see him calculating, weighing options, deciding how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. "This isn't over," he said. "This is over." After Samuel left, Clara stood in her kitchen surrounded by James's letters and felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Absolute certainty. She knew now what her heart had been trying to tell her, knew what decision she'd been fighting against making. She loved James Callahan. Not the boy who had left her 3 years ago, but the man he had become, scarred, damaged, haunted, but still fundamentally the same person who had promised to come back to her under the Montana stars. The man who had kept that promise, even if it had taken him longer than either of them had expected. Clara gathered up the letters and held them against her chest, feeling the weight of all the love and hope and pain they represented. Tomorrow she will tell James what Samuel had said, would warn him about the danger they both faced. But tonight she would make peace with her decision and prepare to fight for the love that had survived war and separation and 3 years of silence. Some promises, Clara realized, were worth keeping no matter how much they cost. And some loves were worth the risk of heartbreak, worth the uncertainty, worth the long journey back to trust and hope. Looking out toward the cabin where James waited, Clara whispered the words she'd been afraid to speak aloud. "Welcome home, James Callahan. Welcome home."
Chapter 11. The Twilight of Doubt. The revelation about Samuel Morrison hung over the farm like the morning mist that settled in the Montana valleys. In the days that followed Samuel's confession, Clara and James remained vigilant. Every unusual sound, every distant figure was a cause for tension. But the real danger, Clara soon realized, was not necessarily an immediate physical threat, but a shadow of doubt that Samuel had known how to plant with surgical precision. James worked with redoubled determination, as if every fence mended, every animal fed, was a brick in a protective wall around Clara and her father. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a distant echo of the man who had read her letters with tears in his eyes. Clara watched him, feeling the weight of Samuel's words echoing in her mind. "He'll leave you again, when the nightmares get too strong, when the guilt gets too heavy." She fought against these thoughts, clinging to the certainty she had felt that night in the kitchen. But fear is a sneaky enemy, finding cracks where certainty wavers. It was on one such afternoon, as James was finishing reinforcing the stable, that the stranger arrived. A tall man, dressed in town clothes but with skin weathered by the sun, rode a dark bay horse that looked like it had traveled great distances. He stopped at the fence, greeted Clara with a respectful nod, and addressed James. "James Callahan?" asked the man, his deep voice echoing in the afternoon silence. James looked up, and Clara saw his shoulders tense almost imperceptibly.
He didn't correct the man, didn't use the pseudonym. He just nodded, wiping his dirt-covered hands on his pants. "Name's William Reed," said the stranger, dismounting. "I work for the Bannock Stagecoach Company. I've heard about you." Clara stopped gathering the eggs she had collected, her heart beginning to beat faster. She moved closer, trying to look busy, but every fiber of her being was on alert. "Heard what exactly?" asked James, his voice cautious. "That you're good with horses, that you keep your cool under pressure, and that you handle a rifle like few others." Reed paused, assessing James. "The route from Bannock to Virginia City is becoming problematic. Thieves, holdups. We lost 2 drivers last month. We need men who aren't scared easily." James crossed his arms. "And what does that have to do with me?" "I'm offering you a job, stagecoach driver. The pay is good, much better than what you must be getting here for this hard work." He cast a quick glance at the farm, the simple house, as if calculating its worth. "It's a job of responsibility, for men who aren't afraid to face danger." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Men who aren't afraid to face danger. The phrase sounded like a challenge, a call to a part of James she barely knew, the soldier, the survivor. James seemed to consider the offer for a moment that felt like an eternity to Clara. His eyes lost themselves on the horizon, beyond the mountains, as if seeing dusty roads and unknown dangers. "I need to think," James finally replied, his voice neutral. "Of course, it's not an easy decision. Life on the road is hard, but it's a life of freedom, away from responsibilities." His gaze rested on Clara for a split second before returning to James. "I'll be at the town boarding house for 2 days. Look me up if you're interested." He mounted his horse again and left, leaving behind a charged silence that was louder than any words. James continued to work, hammering a nail into the stable with precise blows, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. He didn't look at her. Night fell, heavy and silent. Dinner was a quiet meal. Clara's father, sensing the charged atmosphere, retired early to his room, leaving Clara and James alone on the porch under a star-dusted sky. "Are you going to consider the offer?" Clara finally asked, her voice fragile in the twilight. James sighed, rubbing his tired face. "Clara, I need to be honest with you. The money is tempting. Your father needs medicine, the farm needs repairs, things that I, as a mere hired hand, could never provide." It was the truth, and she knew it, but it was a truth that hurt. "And is that the only reason?" she whispered. "The money?" James was silent for a long moment, looking at his calloused hands. "The road is simple, Clara. You know where you're going, you know the dangers. It's a logic I understand. Fighting clear elements, visible enemies, that's something I know how to do." He raised his eyes to her, and in them Clara saw the confusion and fear he was trying to hide. "Here, things are complicated. The enemies are shadows, like Samuel. The battles are fought in here." He touched his own chest. "And those are the battles that scare me the most." Samuel's words came back to haunt her like a ghost. "He'll leave you again when things get too hard." "Are you afraid to stay?" The question came out as a whisper. "I'm afraid of failing you again, Clara." The explosion came loaded with raw anguish. "I'm afraid that my demons are too big, that one day I'll wake up and not be the man you need me to be. I'm afraid that Samuel might be right." He took a deep breath, trying to control himself. On the road, I be paid to face simple dangers. Here, I face my own monsters for free. And the price of failure is seeing the disappointment in your eyes again. Clara felt her heart break. He wasn't thinking about leaving because he didn't love her. He was thinking about leaving because he loved her too much and doubted his own ability to be worthy of that love. James Callahan, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. You went through a war. You survived injuries, loneliness, the very darkness of your own soul. You faced rustlers for me, and you still think you're a coward? Sometimes, Clara, the bravest thing to do is to walk away. His voice was full of a pain so deep she could barely stand it. If I stay and fail, if I hurt you or your father during a nightmare, if I'm not strong enough to protect you from Samuel, it would destroy me. On the road, the only one I can hurt is myself. She stood up and went to him, kneeling in front of his chair and taking his calloused hands in hers. You are not that boy who left for war anymore, James, and I am not the girl who stayed waiting. We both changed. We both were marked. But the love we felt on that porch 3 years ago, it survived the war, the silence, the distance, and the pain. It is strong enough to survive this too. She looked into his eyes, begging him to see the truth she carried in her own heart. The decision is yours, James. It always will be. But know this, if you go, this time it won't be a silent goodbye. This time I know you're alive, and this time I will not wait. Waiting almost destroyed me last time. If you leave now, after having found me again, after making me believe we can rebuild, that will be a choice, and it will be a final goodbye. She stood up, leaving his hands empty, and went into the house, leaving him alone under the stars with the weight of a decision that could destroy everything they had recovered or solidify the fragile new beginning they had built. The twilight of doubt had arrived, and with it, Clara's deepest fear. Would their love survive another farewell?
Chapter 12. Letters at Twilight. The night was long and sleepless for Clara. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind sounded like footsteps on the porch, like the soft closing of a cabin door. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had laid her heart bare on the porch, issued an ultimatum born of 3 years of pain, and now she was terrified of the silence that answered it. Had he already gone? Had her words driven him away, proving Samuel right? The doubt was a physical ache. Just before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of empty roads and unanswered letters. She was awoken by the sounds of an axe splitting wood. It was a steady, rhythmic, purposeful sound, not the hurried chops of a man preparing to leave, but the measured, enduring beat of a man settling in. Clara scrambled from her bed, rushing to the window, without even pulling on her shawl. In the yard, in the soft, peach-colored light of the new dawn, James was working. He had already split a sizable pile of firewood, and his shirt was dark with sweat despite the morning chill. He worked with a focused intensity, as if he were chopping not just wood, but the very doubts that had plagued them both. He paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve, and looked toward the house. He didn't smile, but his eyes, even from this distance, held a new kind of resolve, a settled peace. He wasn't leaving. The relief that washed over Clara was so profound it buckled her knees. She sank onto the edge of her bed,
tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face. He had chosen them. He had chosen her. When she walked out onto the porch an hour later, dressed and composed, the morning was full and bright. James was carrying the last of the wood to stack by the kitchen door. He set it down and turned to face her. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic speeches. They had moved beyond that. The Reed Fellow. I went to see him at first light. Told him my answer was no. James said her, his voice rough but clear. Clara simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. Told him I already had a job, a lifetime's worth of work, right here, if the woman I love will still have me. The words, spoken so plainly in the clear morning air, were more powerful than any poetry. Clara closed the distance between them, her hands finding his. They were rough and splintered and real. The woman you love will have you, today, tomorrow, always. It was not an easy path they chose that day. The shadows of the past did not vanish with the morning mist. Samuel Morrison, thwarted and furious, tried one last desperate gambit, spreading venomous rumors about Jake Collins through the town. But this time, James did not hide. He stood beside Clara at the church social, his back straight, his gaze steady, and met the curious and sometimes hostile stares of his old neighbors. He was James Callahan, home from the war, and he was staying. Dr. Mitchell, with a wisdom that surprised no one, became their unlikely champion, quietly confirming the truth of James's service and injuries, quelling the worst of the gossip with his respected word. William Thompson, watching from his chair by the window, saw the change in his daughter. He saw the light return to her eyes, the worry ease from her brow. One afternoon, he called James to sit with him. "You put that light back in her. That's all a father ever wants for his child. You protect it, son. You protect her. With my life, sir." James vowed, and it was a promise he knew, to his very bones, he would keep. Summer bled into autumn, painting the Montana hills in gold and fire. Together, they managed the farm, the rhythm becoming a seamless dance of shared labor and quiet understanding. James's nightmares did not disappear, but on the nights when he woke, sweating and trembling, Clara was there, not to startle him, but to whisper his name, to anchor him to the present, to the safety of their home. Her presence became his talisman against the ghosts. One evening, as the sun began to set in a spectacular blaze of orange and purple, James brought a small, worn leather satchel into the main house. He placed it on the kitchen table beside Clara's wooden box. "I think it's time," he said quietly. "Past time." With trembling fingers, he untied the leather straps and poured out the contents. 18 letters, sealed with wax that had never been broken. 18 pieces of his heart, written in the darkness and never sent. Clara picked up the one on top. It was dated just after Chickamauga. She broke the seal and began to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room. "My dearest Clara, I don't know if I'll live through what's coming. The Confederates are gathering for what promises to be a terrible fight, and I can feel death hanging over this place like a shroud. If I don't survive, know that my last thought was of you, standing on your porch in the twilight. Know that you made a doomed man believe in a future." Tears streamed down her face as she read, She read of his pain, his fear, his guilt, his unwavering love. She read all 18 letters, one after another, as James sat silently, finally allowing her to share the burden he had carried alone for so long. It was the final act of trust, the last wall between them crumbling to dust. When she finished, the room was dark, lit only by a single lamp. Clara gathered the unsent letters and placed them gently in her wooden box, alongside the ones she had treasured for so long. The story was complete now. The long silence was finally filled. She took out a fresh piece of paper, dipped her pen in ink, and looked at James, who was watching her with an expression of such profound love it made her heart ache. "What are you writing?" he asked softly. "The last letter," she said, a small, peaceful smile touching her lips. She began to write, not with the anguish of waiting, but with the profound joy of arrival. "My dearest James, I write this not by lamplight, waiting for a dawn that may never come, but by the warm glow of the fire in our own home. The man I love sleeps in the next room, and the sound of his breathing is the sweetest music I have ever known. The waiting is over, the fear is past. The letters that were once my only comfort now rest beside the ones you wrote for me alone. And together they tell our story, not just of loss and separation, but of return and redemption. You asked me once if love could survive the changes war inflicted on a man's soul. I know the answer now. It does more than survive. It heals. It builds. It grows stronger in the broken places like wildflowers after a fire. We have a life ahead of us, you and I. A simple life, perhaps, but one built on a foundation of love that has been tested by time and distance and fear and has proven unbreakable. The reunion is complete. The promise made under the Montana stars has finally been kept. All my love now and forever, your Clara." She did not seal it. She did not need to send it anywhere. She simply folded it and placed it on top of all the others in the box. James came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They looked at the closed box together, a lifetime of words contained within it. Outside, the last light of day faded from the sky, giving way to a blanket of stars. But inside, there was no darkness, only the warm, enduring light of a love that had finally found its way home. And so, under the vast Montana sky, a simple story finds its truth. Not in grand gestures or easy paths, but in the quiet, enduring power of a promise kept. It's a story that reminds us that love is not the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to face it together. That true strength is found in vulnerability, and that the deepest healing begins with trust. In a world that often moves too fast, the tale of Clara and James calls us back to the values that truly last. Faithfulness through trial, the redemption found in second chances, and the unwavering belief that love, once truly given, can weather any storm and outlast any silence. If this journey of heartbreak and hope moved you, please subscribe to our channel. We dedicate ourselves to bringing you more stories like this, tales that stir the soul, celebrate the human spirit, and remind us of the timeless power of love and honor. Thank you for watching. Until the next story.